Zoals we sinds Andy Warhol nooit meer op dezelfde manier naar een blikje Campbellsoep kijken, zo kunnen we sinds Bruno Latour nooit meer op dezelfde manier naar wetenschap kijken. Waarlijk, Bruno Latour is de Andy Warhol van de wetenschap. Aldus werd onlangs Bruno Latour omschreven, het enfant terrible van de wetenschapsfilosofie. Om inzicht te krijgen in de wetenschapspraktijk dook hij 2 jaar lang onder in het prestigieuze Salk-laboratorium voor microbiologie in Californië, waar hij nauwgezet het dagelijks leven observeerde. Zijn bekendste boeken, Laboratory Life en Wetenschap in actie, veroorzaakten een aardschok onder wetenschapsfilosofen.
Beta-endorphin. On the table, the protocol book, the mass spectrum, the HPLC spectrum. We discuss from one book to another. Link asks why there is a difference between the first alpha endorphin and the beta endorphin. Guillemin says what Scott should calculate from the books. Delay time. They complete the book exchanging information. Why is there a difference in the behavior of 2 same type of endorphin? They discuss the amino acid composition. We discuss a paper, what image of HPLC should be included in the paper, what will be beautiful to show the final product. Depends on how much emphasis you want to put on that, on alpha or beta or gamma endorphin. We don't need to show that, says Guillemin. We are limited to 4 pages. Nick quotes an article which would explain the delay time of the quoted alpha endorphin and its expression.
Moet wetenschappelijke kennis falsifieerbaar zijn? Zijn wetenschappers de ridders van de rede of machiavellistische machtsverlustelingen? Het zijn vragen waarmee het oeuvre van Latour doortrokken is. Inmiddels is hij geëerd, gelauwerd en verguisd hoogleraar sociologie van wetenschap en techniek aan de University of California in San Diego en aan de École Nationale Supérieure des Mines in Parijs.
I didn't want to do armchair epistemology, which is usually the case with philosophers of science, which have sometimes a good knowledge of science, but not of a practice, daily practice of science. And I simply spend, like anthropologists do, 2 years in the laboratory, writing down every little boring things which happens in a day, and all the little things which happen to my understanding and my reception by my so-called savages, and produce one of these many cases of notebooks about daily life in the laboratory. And that changed our view of science, because we now have a detailed account of scientific practice in addition to what scientists say of themselves. So here I pay attention to lots of little details which are absolutely obvious for them. The whole details of practices, which, since they are skillful practitioners, they don't even think of writing down or speaking about, which me, as a complete unskillful technicians in the laboratory, I immediately stumble across and write down all the little things, exactly like anthropologists do. So I think the attention to practice is much more visible for an outsider than for a scientist, and that makes a big difference, because science is not made only of ideas, it's made of locations, of practices, of instruments, of lots of things which scientists know, of course, but implicitly, which the whole group of people who did these studies have sort of made explicit.
When was the first time you thought, well, I have to go into the laboratory and scrutinize scientists as if they were aboriginals?
This was in Africa, doing field work and studying lots of attitudes and mental practices which were supposed to be due to the African character of students and engineers I was studying while I was in Ivory Coast. So I got dissatisfied with the literature I was reading about mentality, about thought, African philosophy and so on. And I was observing the linkages between these so-called mental attitudes and the practice of industry, villages and schools I was studying. So then I decided or got the idea that it must have been the same, it must be the same with the so-called scientific thinking. March 18, morning. A big meeting in the Oval Office with the president and representative of the diabetic patients. The boss gives a very moving speech explaining that research is soon going to break through, that it's always slow, that red tape is a major problem, and that much more money is needed to train young researchers, parents of diabetic, and urge the president to give priority to this research and to facilitate as much as possible the testing of new drug from the boss's laboratory. The president himself promised he will do his best. Lunch. The boss has a working lunch at the National Academy of Science. He tries to convince his colleague to create a new subsection. He explained that without this, all his colleagues in this new discipline are lost either in physiology or in neurology, and their contribution is not rewarded as it should be. We should have more visibility for neuroendocrinology, he says. We discuss how to vote down another colleague, but I am 3 tables away and do not hear who is. Afternoon. A bit late at the board meeting of the journal Endocrinology. I just learned from the secretary that the boss complains about the discipline being ill-represented and about bad referees who turned out hosts of good papers because they know nothing about the new discipline.
Do scientists discover facts?
Now, the notion of discovery is a very bad way of rendering what scientists do, and it's actually a very unfair way of doing, because it sort of erases the work scientists have to do in order to discover. So the notion of discovery is certainly not one of those notions that can be kept in the study of science. So we turn around words which have to do with construction, constitution of fact, which doesn't mean that the facts are not there. It means that they are made of lots of things, including scientific practices, instruments, community, laboratory, museums like that, collections. For instance, here, you cannot even think of classifying crystallography or geology without the drawers, without the collections, without the institution of this museum at the École des Mines. So the notion of discovery is a very bad way. But so for instance, here, if I was a crystallographer, which I'm not, I would be able to use these collections, these drawers, these specimens, these diagrams there, these maps, in order to speak in the name of what the crystals down there in the earth are. But they are no longer down there on the earth. They are mobilized, they are socialized, they are presented, they are made coherent inside this institution of a museum.
But whatever you say, crystals do what they do, independent from your sayings.
Well, if they were independent, they wouldn't be here in this room. If they were independent, if they were nature as they are, they wouldn't be in this room, right? They would be down in the earth. You wouldn't see them. So they are not independent. They are mobilized. They have been brought here. They are given labels. They are highly theorized specimens excerpted from the earth. All of this work is the work of a scientist. By just thinking of the crystals as independent, you discount the work of a scientist. You discount precisely what is all the energy, what is their specificity, what they think day and night is how can I mobilize crystals inside the science of crystallography. So precisely they are no longer things themselves. They are things inside the network of crystallographers, collections, geology, museums and so on.
Archimedes die in bad Eureka roept. Newton die een appel ziet vallen. Dat is het gangbare beeld van de wetenschapper. Iemand die de natuur observeert en zo ontdekkingen doet. Een scherpzinnig denker, gezegend met verfijnde zintuigen. Dienaar van de rede, zoeker van de waarheid. Aldus heeft de wetenschapper een grote autoriteit gekregen. Als de wetenschap heeft ontdekt dat water bij 0 graden bevriest, dan twijfelt niemand daar meer aan. Wat de paus aan gezag heeft ingeboet, kreeg de Nobelprijswinnaar erbij.
Wat in waarheid is aan deze zijde van de Pyreneeën, is een leugen aan gene zijde.
De moderne wetenschap stelt de natuur als manipuleerbaar voor.
Wetenschappers zijn als slaapwandelaars. Terwijl ze niet weten wat ze doen, doen ze het met volmaakte zekerheid en succes.
Wetenschappelijke waarheid is boven alle twijfel verheven en als de geleerden zich soms vergissen, komt dat omdat ze zich niet aan de regels hebben gehouden.
We kunnen alleen datgene werkelijk begrijpen wat wij zelf hebben gemaakt.
Luister niet naar wat een wetenschapper zegt dat hij doet. Kijk naar wat hij feitelijk doet.
For instance, the Curie's Palladium was first acclaimed, redesigned after every trial in a single laboratory in Paris in 1898. To convince dissenters that this was indeed a new substance, the Curie had to modify the trials and renegotiate the definition of their object. For each suspicion that it might be an artifact, they devised a trial that links its fate to a more remote and less disputable part of physics. There is a moment in the story when the claim becomes a new object, and even a part of nature.
But isn't it so that scientists discover nature? They have a theory and test it in relation to the nature, and when it's falsified, then it's over with the theory. Isn't that the way science works?
That's a textbook version of science. I don't think there is any case where this works as nicely as this. First, because science has no real outside. The idea is that, on the contrary, you build a world inside the laboratory which has some resemblance and connection with the world outside. But this outside nature, it's a world which is itself highly equipped with instruments, with practices, body practice, skilled practitioners, technicians, and so on. So if it was so naive that something in the laboratory and then you try outside the laboratory, it will never work.
Why not? Water freezes at 0 degrees, whether at the laboratory or outside.
Well, do it outside. You have to bring a thermometer. You have to bring something which is coming from the laboratory in order to prove it. You can extend the laboratory in another part of the network. And in the case of thermometer, for example, you can calibrate them. The Dutch are very famous for calibrating that in the 18th century. But it's an enormous work. You need institutions, you need congresses, you need meeting of scientists in order to decide if what is the good standard to calibrate the instrument. You need industry to fabricate the instruments. And then and only then, you can extend it outside. And the outside is if you want, the succursale, the outpost of the laboratory.
But now it's true. I mean, water freezes at 0 degrees. There's no doubt about that.
No, this is a stabilized fact. It's stabilized inside the network and it circulates without anyone paying any attention to it. It's not a very interesting fact.
Does a scientist need a network to make up his ideas?
Well, I mean, if you are alone by yourself and trying to show that such an interesting fact as a freezing temperature of water is stable, you cannot do it. It's by definition a collective achievement. Fact construction is so much a collective process that an isolated person builds only dreams, claims and feelings, not facts.
But you can be right without having a network. Take Galilei. He said that the Earth was not the center of the universe after Copernicus. Well, he was right in the end, despite he was alone.
Well, that's a very unhistorical way of putting the question. He was not alone. First, he was extremely well established. He had enormous connection, including the Pope himself. He was well connected. He was professor in university, and he was associated with almost everything courtly, which in the court, which has any name, and he was associated with, through the telescope, through calculation, with lots of non-humans. Don't forget the non-humans. The mistake in all this question is to suppose that there are only two alternatives. One is to say discovery. We do nothing. We just open the veil and see nature. And the other side is just we make it up and we invent. But that's the two alternatives are entirely false. What exists is scientists associating themselves with non-humans in order to modify some other aspects of the society. So Galileo did associate himself with lots of non-humans, the moon, modifying the moon, what it was made of, falling bodies, the church, the definition of Bible, the Pope, the court, and that's the new organization of society and non-humans that he proposed. This has nothing to do with the alternative between discovery, Galileo all alone in his laboratory thinking out, and on the other side, the idea of a sort of fiction.
But isn't this a pity? I mean, then objective knowledge isn't possible.
It's not possible? Well, it is possible. It's made every day in all the laboratories in the world. The question is, how is it made? It's not the product. The result is objectivity. How it's carried out is different from the old image of objective mind. See, that's the big difference, is that people believed before that objectivity was produced by objective mind. So scientists were supposed to be like Dr. Spock with some sort of strange ears and being different minds. No, they are in different locations. They are in laboratories, they are in collectives, in groups of people who sort of check on each other, and they collectively produced objectivity. But objectivity is a result. It's like a farm where you produce milk. So you milk. Science, the product of science is objectivity, exactly like milk is a product of a dairy farm. It doesn't mean that it's produced objectively. A farm is not producing milk milkily. The notion of an objective science producing objectivity is ridiculous. It's confusing the product, objectivity, with the process, which is completely different from a product.
But that's strange. Take, for instance, Pluto, the planet Pluto. It was always there, even before it was discovered. So nothing changed with Pluto after it was discovered.
Well, of course, lots of things changed with Pluto. Pluto was absent, completely absent from the human astronomy. Pluto has been mobilized inside since when? Actually, I don't know. I don't know when. Discover Pluto. Pluto has been brought in, mobilized inside the world of human astronomy. That's a big change for Pluto as well.
You think so?
Yeah, of course. The Pluto we care about, which is the Pluto inserted inside astronomy, has been modified deeply. If it was not, if Pluto was completely absent from the human astronomy, we will not know anything about it, right? It will be like this Earth crystal we were talking about. They will be in themselves.
But will it change something on Pluto itself? No.
Well, it's a meaningless question. It does modify a lot. Every time you send a probe, if you send a satellite probe, Pluto will have a completely different atmosphere, will be considered differently, will have a history, which is a common history between us, the human astronomer, and it, Pluto. What we are studying is the common history of humans and non-humans. To insist constantly that the non-humans are there is to misrepresent science. It's just to forget that if it were there would be no science of it. It's precisely because we enter into a common history that science is interesting. So why always insisting on the fact that it's there? Yes, of course, it's there. But that's not the interesting thing. The interesting thing is that it's inserted into our human astronomy and modifying it deeply, and probably also modifying lots of other things inside mathematics, inside the definition of planets and so on.
Daar heb je de uitgangsstof van gemaakt. Maar nooit gekoppeld. En stel dat we hem koppelen en we krijgen één ander meer. Wat hebben we dan? We hebben een artikel. We moeten eens kijken, want anders nemen we veel te veel hooi op ons vork. Dus jij gaat kijken van, nou, dit is onderwerpje 1.
Ja, maar kijk, dit wil ik gewoon even afwerken voor dat praatje.
Je kunnen denken aan zoiets als die enzymatische dingen.
Ja, maar dat vind ik ook weer voor die slater. Ik vind het wel goed dat je de literatuur daarvoor opzoekt. Ja. Kijken hoe duur of het enzym kost. En al die grappenmakerijen. Ja. Kijken of we dat kunnen regelen. Misschien moet je een automatische titrator hebben. Weet ik veel wat van narigheid. Maar dat vind ik allemaal goed. Als jullie maar zorgen dat we over 3 weken het amidit hebben. 3 weken amidit en 4 weken het oligo.
Oh.
Ja, en jij moet 25 slapen. Alles wat we erbij kunnen doen, vind ik oké. Ja. Vind ik hartstikke leuk zelfs.
In de literatuur hebben ze maximaal 15%.
15?
15.
Dat is gewoon veel te weinig, dan moet je iets verzinnen. Nee, maar ja, deoxyuridine, dat is hartstikke duur.
Hey Corine, wanneer moet het DWP-project klaar zijn? Dima wil het ook niet. Morgen, maar ik wist volgende week maandag. Kan het volgende week maandag?
Ja, dat kan.
Goed. Ja, rustig aan. Ik bedoel, als het een paar dagen te laat is, dan maakt het niet uit. Als het maar mooi is. Het moet een beetje reclameachtig zijn. Ja? Snap je wat ik bedoel? Ja, oké. Nee, wacht even. Hè. Toen was het op. Toen zei jij, ik heb nog een reserveproef. Nee, ik zeg, ik heb op.
Scientists are not dealing with the outside world as an outside world. They are bringing in the outside world inside our culture. See, you have to change the anthropology of the scientist. It's not the scientist breaking away from the social in order to access things. It's scientists mobilizing things inside the society.
Wetenschapsmensen, zo lijkt het, hebben een speciale manier om naar de werkelijkheid te kijken. Diverse filosofen hebben daar, vooral in de loop van deze eeuw, kanttekeningen bij geplaatst. Zo stelde Karl Popper dat een wetenschapper helemaal niet als een onbeschreven blad aan het observeren slaat. Een onderzoeker heeft altijd een vooronderstelling, een hypothese. Zolang de onjuistheid van die theorie niet is aangetoond, houdt hij eraan vast. Thomas Kuhn wees er vervolgens op dat wetenschappers kuddedieren zijn. Ze hollen massaal achter een gangbare theorie, het paradigma, aan. Zien ze verschijnselen die tegen de theorie indruisen, dan kijken ze gewoon even de andere kant op. Pas als het echt niet anders kan, omhelzen ze een nieuw paradigma.
I felt that it was quite clear that the scientific attitude is the critical attitude. And it was also quite clear to me that a critical attitude is an attitude which tries to put the theory to a test and to put it to a severe test, means an attitude of trying to falsify one's own theory. I would say every time when he does find out that some of his conjectures have been wrong, that means really error, he has got some result. He has got somewhere near the truth.
But aren't scientists getting closer to truth?
I mean, it's not a nice way, it's not an interesting way of describing the fact of science. It's what scientists need to get agitated and money and so on. But it's not a description of their practice. And I'm interested in describing their practice. The result will be truth. Maybe the result will be objectivity. But that's not the process, the way you achieve it. And I'm interested in the way you achieve it. Can I take my example of Pasteur? Well, if you take... This is a very famous experiment by Pasteur on spontaneous generations, against spontaneous generation. And now, the argument was that if you put something here, which is a sort of culture medium of good quality, after a few days you will get lots of little life organisms. Pouchet and the spontaneous generation people said that this little organism here were arriving spontaneously. Pasteur said it was impossible, that they had to be inserted and coming from the atmosphere in the air. Now, he devised an experiment, which sort of crucial experiment, if there is such a thing, which decided against spontaneous generation. Now, here's an experiment which settles the question. Is this true? Yes. Why? Because we still live now, 100 years later, in the destiny, in the wake of the laboratory's practice in which this experiment has been made. This is the invention, basically, of sterilization. Of course, now, in order for this to be true, Pasteur devised this instrument which let the air go through. Here, this is open here. So the air can still have access to it. But as long as you leave it like this, the medium here remains absolutely transparent. If you do this, and you let the dust come into contact with the liquid here, it becomes immediately polluted, and lots of microorganisms. Now, this sort of experiment, this is a small laboratory practice here. It's an instrument which has been invented in a laboratory. Outside of the laboratory, you cannot prove it. If you let a culture medium, it's full of organisms. Inside this little flask, it stays constantly pure. Now, if we describe this operation by using the word true, what do we add? We just misrepresent the situation. We don't add anything. If we now try to understand that Pasteur is creating a laboratory practice, inventing a world inside which it's possible to maintain this little medium transparent all the time, and that nowadays, 100 years later, we are still able to live inside the same practice as long as we do the same thing in the laboratories, then we start to explain something about the behavior of a microorganism. Now, the microorganism here, like your Pluto that we talked about, are modified deeply by being in contact with this medium. This flask has been invented by Pasteur. Didn't exist before. No, never before the microbes were allowed to be in contact with the air. The air lost the little particles of dust inside this little curve, and here no microorganism could be reproduced. This is new also for the microorganisms. As in Machiavelli's Prince, the progressive building up of an empire is a series of decisions about alliances. With whom can I collaborate? Whom should I write off? How can I make this one faithful? Is this other one reliable? Is this one a credible spokesperson? But what did not occur to Machiavelli is that these alliances can cut across the boundaries between human beings and things. Every time an ally is abandoned, replacement needs to be recruited. Every time a sturdy link disrupts an alliance that would be useful, new elements should be brought in to break it apart and make use of the dismantled elements. These Machiavellian strategies are made more visible when we follow scientists and engineers. Rather, we call scientist and engineer those subtle enough to include in the same repertoires of ploys human and non-human resources, thus increasing their margin for negotiation. The definition of powers and politics is now mixed with science and technology so much that we can no longer make this distinction, which has been useful in the past, between politicians interested only in power, which is wrong about politicians, and scientists who are only interested in truth. I mean, you open your newspaper and you take any single example, going from the size of a dam to be built in order to protect Holland against devastation by the sea, to the next test against AIDS, to the next definition of a cure against one of the genetic diseases, you get these imbroglios or this mix-up of science and technology. So the people who still imagine that there are two sources of power, absolutely different, with no connection, Machiavellian grabbing from power, politics, and truth, are just, I mean, they live in a different world. They live in the past. They have no connection with what we call the collectives in which we live. And I'm interested in studying the collective, not in imagining what people could believe in the 19th century or in the 18th century, when science was trying to break away from religion and saying we are dealing only with truth, not with superstition. This is an old definition of science.
De grote tragedie van de wetenschap is het om zeep helpen van een schone hypothese door een akelig feit.
Het verschijnsel van menselijke kennis is zonder twijfel het grootste wonder in ons heelal.
Wetenschap is geen strenge en veeleisende schooljuffrouw, maar een aantrekkelijke en toegefelijke minnares die iedere wens van haar minnaar probeert te voorkomen.
Wetenschap is wat waarneming en redenering vroeg of laat opleveren en niet van jou of mijn grillen afhangt.
De positieve wetenschap zou voltooid zijn als alle verschijnselen voorgesteld kunnen worden als bijzondere aspecten van één enkel algemeen feit.
Have you got any idea why people are often so irritated about your ideas?
I don't know if people are irritated. Those who are mostly people with very precise political interest. And most of philosophy of science, which has been developed by Popper, by Lakatos, is a philosophy to protect the independence of science against the intrusions, the invasion by interest, power meaning brute force, and sentiments. So most of the philosophy of science which is spread in textbooks and in people who are not scientists is linked to that. So that you have a science, and the science is all the better if it's protected against the intrusion of society. On the other side, you have the intellectuals, humanists, literary people, who believe that the soul, the subject, has to be protected against science. Objectification, rationality, people like Habermas, for instance, who say that the more you protect the human subject against techniques and science, the better it is. So we have two types of people, those who say science has to be protected against the invasion by power and politics, and those who say the human subject has to be protected against the invasion by technology and science.
And what's your position?
The problem is that if I irritate someone, I don't know, I irritate both. Because I say science and technology is interesting. It's a complete new intrusion of non-humans into the collective. That irritates the humanists and the people who believe that science and technology are cold, boring, only true and objective and rational. And if I say that they are full of interesting social aspect, I irritate the other one, the people who believe that science should be protected against society. My position is that we don't have to protect science against society, an invasion of society. And we don't have to protect the subject against the invasion of science. Because that's not the way. They are not two different things. One which would be objectivity and the other one which would be politics. There is only one, which is what I call the collective, which is the linkages and the associations we make between humans and non-humans. And that's why they sometimes are irritated. If in the bus your neighbor says, "Nice weather today, hey?" and you answer, "That's a ridiculous statement, because the mean temperature today is 4 degrees below the normal average, computed on a 100-year basis at Greenwich Observatory by Professor Cullen and his colleague using no less than 55 weather stations. Check their methodology in Acta Meteorologica, you fool." Your neighbor will certainly think you are strange and will probably move to another seat.
Some people, Hegelians and others, asserted not only truth, spoke about truth, but believed that they had absolute truth in their pockets, that they knew the absolute truth. This led to a very understandable reaction. And this is what led to relativism. That is to say, that relativism is the view that things are relative. For me it looks like this, for you it looks differently. And that is a very nihilistic view. It undermines the search for truth.
Why should we believe you? I mean, is your theory falsifiable?
No, but none of probably the notion of falsifiability is a complete myth of epistemologists as well.
Why is the system of falsification a myth?
Well, because to falsify, you need to agree on so many things in order to falsify. It doesn't mean it's a myth in terms of, the Popperian falsification is a myth because it means that all the theory would be defeated very immediately. For example, if I take again this example, if Pasteur had falsified his myth, his theory about spontaneous generation, he would have made an experiment where spontaneous generation would have appeared. And there were plenty. Because at the time, every single experiment in all the laboratories around Pasteur were proving Pouchet, the spontaneous generation, right. And he built a world inside this little ballon here, swan neck flask, that's what it's called, in which there was no reproduction of an organism. And he called that a positive replication. When all the others say it's negative, because you don't get life into it, right? So this simple example of falsification is again, all this philosophy of science is armchair philosophy of science. It's very far from the empirical example. So when you ask me what are my proofs, my proofs are all the empirical example, all the field study, all the years of studying scientists that we bring in when we have to demonstrate our cases. It doesn't mean that it's stronger than the sciences. It means that it's not weak. And that's all we can ask.
De vraag of er eigenlijk wel een objectieve waarheid en werkelijkheid bestaat, houdt filosofen al lang bezig. Ludwig Wittgenstein ging aan het begin van deze eeuw zelfs zo ver dat hij weigerde toe te geven dat in de kamer waar hij was geen neushoorn aanwezig was. Bruno Latour past in de traditie van Wittgenstein en Thomas Kuhn. In de manier waarop wetenschapsmensen naar de werkelijkheid kijken zitten veel vooronderstellingen verstopt. De waarheid wordt gekleurd door de bril die onderzoekers opzetten. Zoals een Chinees gezegde luidt: we zien de dingen niet zoals ze zijn, we zien ze zoals we zelf zijn.
When science is not about objective truth, then what is science?
Well, if you want to define positively, I think the best definition is anthropologically. It's what allows us to modify our life by bringing in our interactions new, fresh resources of non-human characters. Let me take one example again in Pasteur. If you take the 19th century before Pasteur, there is no microbes in the relations that people have between one another. After Pasteur, they have relation with one another, plus relation with a million different type of microbes. Microbes revealed by bacteriological laboratories. So now we have a world, a social world, in which we are social relation, plus microbes, plus microbiologists and laboratories. And that, as we go, we complicate the number of elements which are inserted into social relation. This definition of science is completely different from the one before, which says you have a society, and then you break away from this society, you build a world of science which has access to completely extraterrestrial objects. That's a big difference. The more we connect a thing of science, a fact of science with the society, the better, the truer, the more objective it is. This is the difference. This is the only big difference between what was in the past and what we have found now.